Welcome everyone to this next video. This time we're going to be analysing Macbeth in Act 1, Scene 7. So this video is going to largely focus on the character of Macbeth. Now I know our essay is focused on Lady Macbeth, but I think it's really useful for you to understand the contemplation that Macbeth goes through before he decides that killing the king is the solution to his problem. At first he seems really reluctant. He doesn't want to do this. He's a man of dignity and respect and bravery. However, it's through Lady Macbeth's later persuasion of him that leads him to committing regicide. So we're going to focus on his soliloquy at the start of Act 1, Scene 7, and then we can have a look to see how Lady Macbeth manipulates him a little bit later on. A quick reminder, this is for your English literature non-examination assessment that we are preparing for. What I'd like us to learn today is how is Macbeth presented at the beginning of Act 1, Scene 7. If we can answer that question at the end of this session, I will be immensely pleased. What I'm looking for is every single one of you to understand what happens in Act 1, Scene 7. So worth us going back a little bit, just making sure we understand what happens between Scene 5 and Scene 7. I don't want us to miss anything out that could be potentially important. I want us to understand what Macbeth says. I want you to really understand what he is saying and the thought process that he goes through. And I'd like us to consider the impact of specific language and techniques as we go through and as we analyse. We've already looked at Act 1, Scene 5, so it's time to look at Act 1, Scene 7. And in this scene, we see Lady Macbeth persuade Macbeth to murder Duncan so that they can become king and queen. We'll quickly look at Act 1, Scene 6, and then move on to our main focus, which is Macbeth in Scene 7 today. We've already looked at Act 1, Scene 5, when Macbeth managed to get back to his castle quicker than Duncan. He was able to send the message beforehand through his letter, in which he was able to explain the prophecies of the witches and his thought process about how one day he might be king. He managed to get back before Duncan, he managed to talk briefly to Lady Macbeth, and then in Act 1, Scene 6, King Duncan arrives at Macbeth's castle. He's accompanied by his entourage, and this comprises of his sons, Malcolm and Donalbain, and his thanes, Lennox, Ross, Angus, Banquo and Macbeth, but he's also accompanied by lots of other attendants who also come into the castle with him. I'll just briefly give you the main synopsis of this scene. So when he arrives to the castle, the first thing he says is, "This castle hath a pleasant seat. The air nimbly and sweetly recommends itself unto our gentle senses." He likes turning up to this castle. He believes this castle is in a beautiful place. It's the type of place where he gets to come to rejuvenate after the battle that's just happened. I think what's really useful for us to pick out is the dramatic irony involved. We know that this castle is not going to be a pleasant place for Duncan to go. We know that this castle is probably going to be the final castle he ever enters. So whilst he believes that this is a very positive place, while he believes this place is going to rejuvenate his senses and he can spend time with his loyal subjects like Macbeth, we understand that this might very well be the final place he enters. Lady Macbeth comes out of the castle to greet her king, King Duncan, and the king says, see, our honoured hostess." Have a look at the adjective he uses to describe Lady Macbeth. He calls her honoured. We know, and the dramatic irony really emphasises this, that this is not a woman with honour. This is someone dishonourable. This is someone dishonest. This is someone who is plotting and scheming to kill the king for her own gain. And yet Duncan does not see this. Duncan is not the type of king who is easily suspicious. He's too trusting. He's too honest. He's too loyal to his subjects. Some people might suggest he's too naive, and that a king should perceive the threats in his kingdom. And this could be evidenced further in the fact that he has people try and take his throne away from him. MacDonald was one of his subjects who stood up against him. So we do see Duncan being a very honest and very trusting king, perhaps to his detriment. And this sentiment is further played upon by Shakespeare. He says, "Fair and noble hostess, we are your guest tonight." And Shakespeare's doing two things here. First of all, he's continuing to show Duncan's level of naivety, using those adjectives fair and noble. Again, the dramatic irony would suggest that she's neither of those things. But what Shakespeare also does is he uses one of the established conventions at the time, which is the idea of hostesses and guests. If a guest were to come into your house, as host, it is your responsibility to keep that person safe. That's a traditional way of treating a guest. It becomes your responsibility. It's expected of you. So by constantly reminding the audience that this host has a responsibility for the guest, it shows that Lady Macbeth is willing to subvert those natural orders that exist in the world. There are lots of rules that exist in a Jacobean society to make sure that society is harmonious. Lady Macbeth is the type of person who is willing to subvert those traditional hierarchies, and she's willing to hurt those people who she should be keeping safe. Throughout this scene, Duncan speaks and Lady Macbeth responds. It's very jovial and it's very happy and it's very respectful. But at the end of the scene, the final thing that Duncan says is, "Give me your hand. Conduct me to mine host. We love him highly and shall continue in our graces towards him." Consider the symbolism of him touching Lady Macbeth's hand. Normally that's a sign of honesty. Normally that's a sign of tenderness and love and respect. However, because we've got the knowledge that this woman is plotting to kill this man, it also shows his real vulnerability and naivety. And he asks Lady Macbeth, "Take me to Macbeth. Take me to your husband. Take me to my host." This host who has a responsibility over him, not just as his host, but also as his servant. He's the king after all. And look at the language he uses towards Macbeth. It continues from what he was saying in Act 1, Scene 2 about him being noble and brave Macbeth. Well, he deserves that name. He says, "We love him highly and shall continue in our graces towards him." He respects Macbeth. He trusts Macbeth. However, all of that trust seems to come crashing down later on in the act. So now that we've had a quick synopsis of Act 1, Scene 6, we can now move on to Act 1, Scene 7. I think it's important for you to know what happens in between these key scenes for Lady Macbeth. Now, before we actually look at Act 1, Scene 7, another reminder of the question that you're going to be answering as your assessment. Examine how Shakespeare presents the strengths and weaknesses of Lady Macbeth. Now, in today's session, we're not going to focus on Lady Macbeth at all. And that seems a little bit strange considering she is the main focus of our entire unit of work. But I think it is so important for you to understand Macbeth's thought process before we see Lady Macbeth next. Otherwise, we won't quite understand why Lady Macbeth acts in the way that she does. So although we're not focusing on Lady Macbeth, everything we do talk about does have repercussions later on in this scene. So this is Act 1, Scene 7. I think what's really useful for us to do is to read through Macbeth's soliloquy before we do any analysis at all. So we'll read it all the way through, we'll listen to the language, we'll consider what he's saying, and then we'll go back to the start and we will analyse each part in detail, and we'll come up with ideas of what Macbeth is saying and why he's saying it and how he's saying it. So Act 1, Scene 7 takes place inside Macbeth's castle. And there are hautboys. Hautboys are a type of old musical instrument, like an oboe. So we've got lots of deep sounds playing around the castle, adding to an atmosphere, quite a foreboding, quite an ominous atmosphere. We also have torches on the walls. Torches are flames. Instead of modern electronic lights, we have torches, flickering flames. Consider the use of shadows. Consider how dark and scary and atmospheric Shakespeare is creating this scene. Possibly because what is going to be spoken about is very dark and dangerous and treasonous. Enter a sewer and divers, servants with dishes and service over the stage. So on stage are lots of people, lots of butlers, lots of servants moving things back and forth. There's lots and lots of people in the castle. The castle has come to life, and Macbeth is hiding away with his thoughts while all of this noise is happening around him. Then enter Macbeth. Once again, we have a character alone on stage. When a character is alone, we as an audience get to see those innermost thoughts. Without all of the protection that goes up around someone's personality, without hiding, without concealing, we get to see the inner machinations of Macbeth's mind. This is what Macbeth says. If it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well it were done quickly. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence, and catch with his surcease success, that but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all here. But here, upon this bank and shoal of time, we'd jump the life to come. But in these cases, we still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instructions, which being taught return to plague the inventor. This even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips. He's here in double trust. First, as I am his kinsman, and his subject, strong both against the deed. Then, as his host, who should against his murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself. Besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, that his virtues will plead like angels, trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off. And pity, like a naked new-born babe striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim, horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air, shall blow the horrid deed in every eye, that tears shall drown the wind. I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which overleaps itself, and falls on the other. At this point, Lady Macbeth enters. So we've taken a look at what Macbeth actually says. It's now time to do our much closer analysis of this soliloquy. And you'll notice that the very first thing that Macbeth says is the word if. And that's repeated. And this would suggest that he's unsure of his path. He's contemplating his actions. He doesn't quite know what to do. He knows what he wants to do, but he's also aware that what he wants to do is not an acceptable path. He's pensive. He's stuck in his thoughts. He's mulling things over. And for me, that juxtaposes very heavily with Lady Macbeth's lack of contemplation or lack of unsurety in the scenes that preceded. She seems much more decisive, and she seems very pragmatic, somebody who knows what to do and will do it. He doesn't. He seems much more thoughtful, much more lost in his identity. We could also talk about the fact that Macbeth refuses to say the word murder or regicide. He uses the euphemism it, if it were done. He can't bring himself to name the deed. This suggests that he knows it's immoral, he knows it's evil, he knows it's wrong. So he can't quite face the word itself. This is a man who is used to brutality, who is used to killing people. But he's always killed for the right reasons previously. So when it comes to killing for the wrong reason, therefore making it murder, it makes him much more hesitant. We could also talk about the adverb quickly, because this shows that Macbeth understands the need to be urgent. He knows that if he's going to capitalise, he needs to do that quickly, but he doesn't seem to have that decisiveness needed if he's going to act quickly. So the line, if it were done when 'tis done, then 'twere well if it were done quickly, he's considering, look, if I'm going to do this action, it's best if I do it quickly to get it over and done with. Again, this might make him sound quite weak. He knows what he wants to do, but he doesn't quite have the conviction in order to do it without thinking everything through. It then starts with the same word we've seen previously, if. He says, if the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his surcease success, what he's saying here is he is hoping that if he's able to kill Duncan and in one big net is able to capture the murder and the consequences of murder altogether, then with the death of Duncan, he gets everything he wants. But this shows that Macbeth is very aware that actions have consequences. He realizes that if he kills the king, step one will be done, but there are lots of other consequences to our actions. He needs to make sure that if he's going to do this, he's got a plan to deal with it all. So he's very aware that he would be subverting the divine right of kings, and that always has consequences, because in the Jacobean era, people believed in balance. They believed in karma, essentially. They believed that, in the end, justice prevails. And to kill the king is one of the most heinous acts you can commit, because by acting against the king, you act against the person who put the king on the throne, which is God himself. So could trammel up the consequence shows that he's worried that the action itself is not the end. And he'd like, in a nice clear net, we've got that nautical imagery being used of trammeling up a net, he's wishing that he could capture the net and the murder all in one, so that it will all be done and come to an end, and then he can enjoy the success afterwards. But he realizes that committing murder has consequence. If the assassination could trammel up the consequence and catch with his surcease success, what we can see is that with Duncan's surcease, by him being killed, by his life ending, surcease means to end, then Macbeth will have success. And he's used the word catch there. What we see is that the more pain and suffering inflicted on somebody else, the more Macbeth will gain. And that's a really horrible thought. The more he takes from someone else, the more he receives. So, and catch with his surcease success, that but this blow might be the be-all and the end-all. He's contemplating whether or not this murder will be the end of the story. I commit the murder, then I'm king, then I live happily ever after. He is very aware that actions have consequences and that these repercussions will come back later. He's not going to be able to kill the king, get away with it, and nobody ever questions it. So he's considering not just the act itself, but whether or not the act itself would even be possible. And there's that moment in his mind where he realizes it won't be the be-all and end-all at all. And then he says, but here, upon this bank and shoal of time, and this is where, again, he sounds uncertain. Look at the word but. It's used frequently throughout this soliloquy. It shows that he is not sure at all. He's in two minds. He's thinking, I can get away with it. No, I can't get away with it. But I'll escape justice. But justice will eventually come back to haunt me. So he says, but here, and he's very clearly suggesting that here, right in this very moment, upon this bank and shoal of time, this mortal life that he's living, this moment right now, we'd jump the life to come. And what he's suggesting is that if he were to kill the king, he would be sacrificing his afterlife for an improved mortal life. Because if you believe in Christianity, as people in a Shakespearean society would, you believe that if you do good things in your life, you get a wonderful afterlife. And if you commit evil acts, then you don't get to go to heaven with all of the other good people. You have a place in hell waiting for you. And Macbeth is contemplating whether this murder would be worth giving up the next life. His life, his mortal life, would get better. He would become king, he'd have more power and responsibility and respect. But he's very aware that that will have a consequence, and he might have to sacrifice something like his life in heaven. And again, the word but turns up. He says, but in these cases, we still have judgment here. So when the word here used previously was about his mortal life, and again he's talking about his mortal life. He's not naive in thinking that he'll be able to get away with this. He believes that if he kills this king, that there is going to be retribution in his lifetime too. He can't just kill the king and then everyone says, well done, Macbeth, you can be king. He understands that he's probably not going to get away with it. Or even if he does get away with it, it's not going to be the end of the story. There are going to be people who challenge him. There are going to be people who become suspicious. So he's considering whether or not it is worth giving up his good life in order to have a more profitable but evil life later. So Macbeth says, but in these cases we still have judgment here, that we but teach bloody instructions. He knows that what needs to be done is going to be violent. He knows that when someone is violent, there are very often repercussions. Violence breeds more violence. And he realizes which, being taught, return to plague the inventor. What Macbeth is suggesting is that his evil deeds that will need to be done won't be able to escape evil deeds being done to him too. He knows that when you do something bad to someone, there's always someone who will take revenge. And that's something that is considered very highly in Shakespearean society. The idea of justice, the idea of bad things happening to bad people in the end, is something that is happening all of the time in Shakespeare's plays. And he describes this as this even-handed justice, because he's very aware that justice is a sense of fairness, and he understands that society is all very finely poised. Harmonious society only exists because everybody chooses to do what's right. And as soon as someone decides to subvert those expectations, that's when things become out of balance, but balance eventually gets restored. So if he does tilt the balance in his favour, at some point the balance will be tilted away from him too. And this even-handed justice commends the ingredients of our poisoned chalice to our own lips. A chalice is like a goblet, like a wine glass, if you will. And he realises that his bad actions are like they're being poured into a glass. All of his evil deeds will be poured into a glass to create a poisonous liquid. And at some point, he is going to be forced to drink from that. So what he's doing is he is creating the repercussions for himself. He knows he's not going to be able to escape them. And at some point, he's going to have to drink this fluid, and it is going to be distasteful. It is not going to taste good when he has to drink that poison. So he realizes that those evil deeds have consequences, consequences that he will not be able to escape. He then moves on to explain why he shouldn't commit regicide. He says he's here in double trust. So he's saying, it's my duty to look after this king. And it's not just one duty he has over Duncan at this moment in time. There are multiple reasons why he's supposed to look after Duncan. So on the one hand, yes, he's king, but secondly, he's his host too. So he has a lot of reasons for being loyal to Duncan. Now, if we're looking at this, it's almost like he's looking for reasons not to kill the king. He's looking for those reasons to make sure that he is able to stay morally good. So he's here in double trust. First, as I am his kinsman and his subject. Macbeth is very aware of the divine right of kings. He knows that the king is in charge of the country, and that right has been given to him by God. He knows that it is a crime to kill the king. He knows that you cannot attack the hierarchy above you. So he realizes that he has a duty to his king. And up until this point, he's been an incredibly good, dutiful soldier. Those people who did try and fight against the king got their comeuppance. He was able to destroy MacDonald. He was able to send Svino back across the sea. So he's been able to maintain that social order at this point. However, he knows that if he were to do something bad, it would subvert that. And that's not his role. He is a kinsman. He has fealty to his king. He is a subject. He is someone who is supposed to respect that natural order. And he says that he is supposed to be strong both against the deed. So that's a really good reason why he should not kill the king. The second reason he gives is that he is his host. And during Shakespearean society, if you were the host, you had a responsibility to keep your guests safe. That was an expectation placed upon you. Now, he knows that he is supposed to protect the king in multiple different ways here, and yet his plotting against him he feels uncomfortable with. And he says, who should against his murderer shut the door, not bear the knife myself. He knows that he should be protecting his king. That's what he's always done. He's attacked those other people who did try and kill the king. He should close the door on those types of thoughts, on those types of people. He should not bear the knife myself. And when he says bear the knife myself, it's almost with a sense of distaste. He hates the idea of using his swords as his skills as a soldier against the person he's supposed to protect. He has an innate sense of loyalty, and he doesn't want to lose everything that he's gained up until this point. It would be cowardly. He's not used the word sword there, he's used the word knife. A much shorter weapon, a weapon that you need to be much closer to in order to use, a weapon that's often used in stealth, with no warning given, a coward's weapon, if you will. He doesn't like the idea of acting as a coward would, and a traitor is considered a coward. The next part, after he says, besides, this Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, it shows that this king is a humble and kind king. He's a ruler that people loved. It's also his weakness, the fact that he's too trusting, he's too honest, and he's too loyal to his subjects. But the fact that Duncan is identified as a meek character further creates Macbeth's evil actions as particularly abhorrent. Because if you've got someone who is very vulnerable in front of you, to capitalise on that and to cause pain to them is even worse than if that person was a worthy adversary. So hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office, and when it says clear in his great office, suggests that King Duncan has been a good king. He's not someone who's been awful. He's not been cruel. He's not used his power for in negative ways. He's the type of person that has been a good and loving king. And this, and his virtues, will plead like angels. So the fact that he is so pure and he is so innocent and good and virtuous, it means that the virtues themselves will scream out at this unnatural act. And they will plead like angels trumpet-tongued. You've got that simile there with the heavenly imagery. It's almost like the angels up in heaven will scream out at the injustice of what Macbeth has done. Here you've got that idea that the divine right of kings is not something that is supposed to be acted against. And Macbeth's contemplation is an evil quality. And that God will not allow Macbeth to live carefree if he were to kill someone as innocent and someone as loving as Duncan. Trumpet-tongued against the deep damnation of his taking off, again a euphemism for his death. The next part it says, and pity like a naked newborn babe. We've got the personification here of pity as a newborn child. And that image of innocence and vulnerability is once again conjured. And this babe would be striding the blast. So when something bad happens to this king, pity itself will go out and tell everybody what has happened. This newborn babe will metaphorically stride around the country and tell everyone what's happened. And if everybody hears about them, particularly if they feel pity, it means that Duncan is going to be even more respected, and the person who kills Duncan will be even more hated. Striding the blast, or heaven's cherubim, horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air. So these creatures, these cherubims, these angels, baby angels, they will almost be on the back of horses, and no one will see them, but these will metaphorically go out and spread the secret, spread what has happened. And they shall blow the horrid deed in every eye. These creatures will go out and tell every single person what's happened. They will show everyone exactly what has happened. So Macbeth is never going to be able to get away with this action. And he knows that. He knows that if I take this step, I won't be able to untake that step. You can only do it once, you can never take it back. The final part of Act 1, Scene 7 continues with that imagery of the eyes, with that tears shall drown the wind. And what we can see here is this imagery is being used, or this metaphor is being used, of every single person in the country will be crying, and their tears will wash from their faces. Because everyone will be upset at what's happened. They'll all lament the king's death, and therefore hate the person who has killed the king. So what Macbeth is showing us is that if he does something bad to the king, it only adds to the level of respect that the king had. The final sentence is, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent. I'm sure you know what a spur is. A spur is used at the back of a boot in horse riding, and when you use the spur on a horse, the horse moves forward and begins its journey. And this is a metaphor. Macbeth is saying, I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent. He doesn't want to implement this murder. He realizes that as soon as he kicks the horse, or as soon as he uses this spur, that he is not going to be able to stop that journey. Once he has decided to do it, he'd have to ride that roller coaster until the very end. And he knows that the end of that story is not going to be good for himself. So he has no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which overleaps itself and falls on the other. The words vaulting ambition there shows us what his reasoning for killing the king would be. It's to get something better. But he's realised that his ambition is jumping too high. He wants to vault. If you vault, you jump over something. He wants to overleap Duncan. He's trying to figure out a way that how he could put himself above Duncan and into the seat of the throne. He realises that this would be going too far. And the final part, where it says, which overleaps itself and falls on the other, shows that he realises that if he were to jump into action, then there is a place that he will land. And yes, he might overleap the king, but the place that he lands will be in a place of tragedy. He'll end up in a worse position than he already is. So towards the end of this soliloquy, he makes the decision that it's better to maintain what he has rather than risk it all in order to get something better, but potentially come across some repercussions. This soliloquy is then interrupted, and it's interrupted by his wife. His wife walks in, breaking his solitude, breaking his soliloquy, and then dialogue follows. I'd like us to read just the next few lines. I think that will give us a really good opportunity to finish in a particularly important place. So as soon as his wife enters, he says, "How now? What news?" You can see the worry in his voice. You can see he wants to know exactly what's going on. You can see he's a little bit jumpy here. Lady Macbeth says he has almost supped. He's almost finished. He's almost ready. She's watching Duncan, reporting on his actions, and for me that gives a sense of a predatory character. She is watching him. She is making sure she has the advantage. She's not letting him out of her sight. She then asks her husband, "Why have you left the chamber?" She's questioning Macbeth's actions. Well, why is he doing this? He shouldn't be doing that at all. And again, this links back to her doubt over her husband. She knows that he is too full of the milk of human kindness. So she's also watching him to make sure that he does what he's supposed to do. She's interrogating her husband. Again, the role of the woman was not to question the man. And yet here we have that subversion of gender stereotype. Macbeth asks, "Hath he asked for me?" And Lady Macbeth responds, "Know you not, he has?" Macbeth then says this line. He says more, but this is where we're going to finish it for today. He says, "We will proceed no further in this business." And for me, that sounds incredibly definite. If you read that line, "we will proceed no further in this business," you can't be confused. That is a very definite statement. There's no ambiguity there at all. He has told his wife he will not kill the king. He's telling his wife really confidently, really cogently, really simply. He's not using metaphors. He's not using ridiculous language. He is simply saying, "I am not going to do this." He uses the euphemism business at the end instead of murder. But this is somebody who is telling his wife, "No, you want me to kill the king, I will not do it." And what I find really interesting, and we'll have a look at this next time, is how Lady Macbeth responds to Macbeth telling her no. Because she doesn't just accept, she begins to manipulate him. And we'll have a look at that next time. What I'm hoping that you've seen from today's session then is the start of Act 1, Scene 7 shows Macbeth in a very contemplative state. He's very pensive, he's very thoughtful, he's considering his actions and he's considering their consequences. And after going through step by step, fairly logically, lots of reasons why he shouldn't commit, what he'll gain from it, what he will lose from it, he makes the decision that he will proceed no further in this business. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. We'll see you next time, and hopefully we'll have a look at Act 1, Scene 7, and we'll have a look at how Lady Macbeth is presented there. Thank you very much. I will see you all next time.